right, thanks so much, Nadia. Welcome back, everybody. So we're on the latter part of the content and the day as well. So thanks so much for hanging in there and coming along for the journey, if you will. So now we're at a stage. So we've talked about what it might look like and could look like from a science or theory-based perspective in terms of the neuroscience of the behavior. And then we talked about, right, so yes, there's the neurons and the axons, and then there's the observable behavior, right, which is resilience. We could call it resilience or just coping skills or adaptations. And then now what I'd like to do is to share some information about trauma-informed practice that you can start to incorporate into your daily practice or use as needed if you're already engaged in some trauma-informed practices as well. So at the start of the day, we started off looking at the difference between trauma-specific services or treatment and trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed care. So the reason I usually start the day by clarifying that is so that you know that, okay, right, we'll eventually get to it, but then as I said also to based on my experience of, if I start with this content first, inevitably the conversation keeps going back to but why, and the reasons why people may be doing what they're doing. So for treatment options, it could be, well, any type of a mental health a treatment service or modality. It doesn't have to be trauma, because if you're thinking about the experience of the person, and what they're showing or what their needs are, it doesn't really matter what caused the issue for the person to seek services from you. Right? And then even if you're not working in mental health and addiction services, I want to think about other types of care that you're providing that could help the person to meet their physical health and or mental health needs as well. And then now thinking about trauma-informed practice, remember it's whether we know that they have experience or with trauma or not, whether it's your job to treat folks or not. Trauma-informed practice means that we're using your existing skill set, building upon it, and then integrating that knowledge into your daily practice. So the next thing to think about is, who could experience trauma. So for folks like us, we know, okay, it's not any one type of person or any one person with a specific age or background, but there are some groups that have the perception or understanding that trauma can only be experienced by really young children or by really vulnerable people. And that's probably because of what they see in movies or what they hear about in the news, so on and so forth. Which is another reason why, I talk about the stress response, because whether it's caused by trauma or stress, the physical experience and the reaction is one and the same. And so to the point, or I should say, that's why I have this quick little note here saying that psychological trauma is an occurrence which is outside the scope of everyday human experience, and which would not be distressing to, would be notably distressing to almost anyone. And so that means is don't have to be a teeny tiny child or a young child, schoolish child or teen. Anyone across the lifespan could experience adverse experiences or unsafe or traumatic circumstances. And then the next thing to think about is, in terms of the who, is, what might that look like? So similar to resilience, there's information about individual experience of trauma as well as a collective experience of trauma as well. So for individual trauma, Here from SAMHSA, the description is individual trauma results from an event, series of events. So that's really important. It's not just one acute or a single event. It could also be a number of events that add up, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or even life-threatening, that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Okay. So we've been, if you think about what's being said there, we've been talking about all of these items already. But the reason that I've highlighted the words event, experience, and effects is that you may see in some trainings or even articles you read, folks referring to the experience of trauma as the 3 E's, right? Or the 3 E's of trauma. And I mean, they won't just say that, but if you do see that, that's where they're getting it from, is thinking about what was the event or series of events. And so the second E, the experience, is really important as well. And that's because if you think about even that idea of positive stress versus tolerable versus toxic, is that there could absolutely be people that have experience of trauma that do not have long-lasting effects or needs like some other folks. Right? And that's because of existing coping strategies they have, or lived experience where they have experienced an adverse event, or maybe even a slightly different type of adverse event, which means their brain already knows that, right, well, this is really, really stressful, it's really dangerous for me, and it'll be okay. Right? So it's really about how we frame that experience that has an influence on if our brain and our body perceives it as traumatic. Which is also why sometimes when you're working with people, you may come across situations where a family group or a group of individuals, even if they're not related, may have experienced the same adverse event or dangerous event. And there could be some folks that are functioning or dealing with it much better than others. And if that's the case, may not be the only reason, but that could be a very significant reason why some folks are able to, shrug it off, or maybe not shrug it off, are able to seek services, accept services, and help and move on. And then the next thing I want to do is to focus on the first part of the description here, which is talking about what causes it, right? So results from an event or series of events. So in the chat, what I'm going to invite you folks to do is to share examples or guesses or ideas that you can think of that you think may cause a person to have an experience of trauma. So what are some types of events or set of events that could be quite dangerous or have long-lasting effects? Sexual assault. Okay, so robbed at gunpoint and shot. So getting robbed is stressful enough. It could be traumatizing for some folks. Getting robbed at gunpoint is an additional layer. And then what you're saying is it was all of those plus they were physically hurt. Right, so abuse in all its forms, sexual, physical, emotional, neglect, fire, death, earthquakes. Yeah, so not even relational situations, but environmental, childbirth. Yeah, absolutely. And with childbirth, even if it's not their first child, could be the unpredictability It could be the fact that they may have a beautiful birth plan and none of it happens the way the person has anticipated it, or it could be an actual medical trauma as well, right? So the way the medical field things describes trauma. Ongoing poverty, absolutely. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be, remember, similar to toxic and chronic stress, I said it's not really about the intensity of the stressor. So here it's exact same. It's not really about the intensity. It's about the fact that it's always present and causing harm. Yeah, traffic accidents, car accidents. Living with a guardian who has a right. So the person or the child doesn't have mental health needs or even physical health needs, but a dependent, right? So whether it's a child, teen, or a dependent adult, could be living in a home where their caregiver has some needs. Yeah, so losing housing or not being able to find housing at all. War, gang violence, absolutely. Serious health crisis, yeah. So, and that could be even receiving a diagnosis, or it could also be ongoing medical care if the person has some sort of a medical need or diagnosis where they're required to have regular visits to a hospital. Yeah, so refugees at borders, yeah, grief or loss. Good examples. Thanks so much, folks. Yeah, so it could be anything that causes the person to experience it as either stressful, not a big deal, and or traumatic. And in terms of types of trauma, so these aren't, causes of trauma, but the way mental health, and addictions folks describe it are acute trauma. So that would be, you can almost think about that as, a single event where the intensity was big enough that could impact anyone, or it's not about the intensity, but it's a single event. Repetitive trauma, so same as, chronic stress, I guess, it keeps happening. Complex trauma and complex developmental trauma. So by adding the word complex, what they're hoping to do is to get people thinking about the fact that, again, it's not about the intensity, but also the relational or the human factor that could be associated with the outcome, which is trauma, right? So in the context of a relationship or in the context of engaging with multiple humans that cause, causes a person to experience it as trauma. Vicarious trauma, which is an experience for people that may not have an adverse event or stressor happen to them directly, but they observe it in their environment. Right? So it could be that example that someone shared here, Kelly, about living with the guardian who has a mental health need, substance dependency, or it could also be specifically for vicarious trauma, these situations where whether it's a child or anyone observes traumatic events or violence, even if it's not actually happening to them directly. Right? So they see it, it could be because they see it, they hear it, or could also be because they read about it. Right? And the seeing doesn't have to be firsthand, it could be on TV, news, media, so on and so forth. And then there's, some more broader traumatic experiences. These are all related, but then specifically thinking about cultural, collective, and historical trauma, and also intergenerational trauma. Christy, yep. So partners of first responders, absolutely. It doesn't have to be an abusive situation, but if even if it's an adult to adult relationship, if the other person isn't functioning at their best, or they're being impacted then yeah, even another adult that's in the relationship could be affected. And then the other thing would be we'll absolutely talk about this experience of vicarious trauma for us, but could also be that the partner that you're referring to as a first responder could be seeing, hearing, and reading about events, right? So not necessarily that they're always involved in serious events, but they could be experiencing vicarious trauma as a result of their job. And the next thing is thinking about collective trauma. So collective trauma here refers to the impact of traumatic experience that affects and involves entire groups of people, communities, or societies. And so the difference between individual and collective is that it could be the same event or the same set of events that cause a whole group of people to experience trauma versus the experience of an individual. Right? So that's the main difference. And so again, as I said earlier, you could be working with a group of individuals, whether it's a family or a community, where some folks are doing okay and some folks may need a bit more support. Difference between, okay, so Chara, were you wondering about what the difference is? Is that what you mean by that? Are you wanting me to talk a little bit about the difference? Okay, correct. So the difference is the I guess the function or the experience of the person depending on what has happened or what is happening. Right? However, so it's a good question because intergenerational trauma is linked to historical trauma. So the reason that both terms are there is that you could have some folks who have experienced historical trauma and not have intergenerational trauma. However, you're not really going to come across anyone who's experiencing intergenerational trauma who hasn't experienced historical trauma. So for historical trauma, I want you to think about literally, right? So a huge expanse of time, hence the word historical, like colonization, some of the previous world wars. So the standard used to be World War I, World War II, and now we haven't had any world wars, but we have lots and lots of conflict and war zones that impact people just as much, or pretty close to the experience of individuals during the two major world wars. So hopefully that makes sense. So historical trauma is something that would have impacted people, in the past. Versus intergenerational trauma is one where the traumatic experience of somebody who experienced that. So let's say it is World War I or World War II or another major event that has impacted them, and then that trauma is experienced by their partners. So Christy had an example of, partners get impacted, and or it could also be their children. And the pathway for that is through interactions, right? So remember before the break, we talked about maladaptive behaviors or unsafe behaviors that are still resilient. And yet those could be, the reasons why our peers or you yourself in child protection have to do the type of work they do, right? Which is why law enforcement has to get involved from time to time. However, the experience of a child being brought up by someone who either has a mental health need, like someone already said, or because it is because of trauma, the experience of the child is that now they're being impacted. Right? So I want you to think about what we typically think of as neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and we know those aren't okay. But then thinking about, right, there is a reason why those adults or those perpetrators or people are still, doing those things to children or other vulnerable adults as well. And then from there, so if you think about So let's say my grandfather experienced historical trauma. The way my grandfather would have parented my father would have an impact, and the way my father then in turn parents me would have an impact on how I function as well. There is a whole other conversation we could have about epigenetics, but there is not just about parenting and what we observe. There is some traumas that are absolutely passed on genetically, which is very similar to the idea of a brainstem retaining information from thousands of years ago when we weren't living in safe housing situations. So hopefully that makes sense, but yeah, so that's how I describe it, the difference. Yeah, so for collective, it's same type of, the cause is the same, but it's now impacting a community and a group of individuals. And when you're thinking about collective trauma, it doesn't always have to be some of those things we talked about as, causes of trauma. The certain groups of individuals or communities could be experiencing trauma because of who they are. Right? Because of what the group is about, because of what the community is, or where the community is, or who the people are that live in a community, so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily even, about what we know might cause trauma for an individual. It could be because they're a targeted group to begin with. So I know you folks had a great list of causes of trauma, which we I think covered pretty much all of these. So here as a topic, I'm saying, so it could be not just causes of trauma, but also thinking about it as causes of toxic or chronic stress. And that's because of the experience in the body and what the body does to manage it or be resilient and deal with it. So as we've said, so natural disasters, of course, if you're displaced, if you get injured, if you lose all of your belongings or lose your support network, you can see how that can be quite impactful for most people. And then we talked about historical and intergenerational trauma. So here I want you to think about things that have happened in our history, right? So in Mi'kmaq in Canada, so the experience of colonization, not just for our Indigenous folks, so primarily for Indigenous folks, but then also the folks that may have been here or that have been here for long durations of time. For example, people of African descent. And then the reason I have racism there is because it's not just for Indigenous folks, people of African descent, Acadians, people of French descent that have been here for a long time, so on and so forth. But racism in general impacts everyone, right? So who doesn't belong to a dominant culture or a mainstream group? Excuse me. And the reason that I have the Holocaust there is not because that happened in Canada, but during that period of time, there were a number of folks, that came to Canada for that reason, right? So they may have started off as right, it's because of the war, and then like, right, there was a Holocaust or genocide happening behind the lines, or could be folks that came to Canada after the fact as well. So I usually talk about those three major historical events because we know that folks are still living with the effects of those historical experiences. But before I move on, I just want to know if folks have any examples of any other historical traumatic events as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think that we could probably agree that there are many, many sources of intergenerational historical sources of trauma, genocides, oppression, uprooting of individuals from Africa, lynching, histories of violence in families. And, you know, there's so much complexity. So even, for example, refugees from the Holocaust, Canada was known as saying no Jew is too many, and turning away many boatloads of people who tried to access safety. So while eventually there was some safety that they were able to get by arriving at the time of the Holocaust, there was, they were turned away. But the levels of genocide that leads to refugees and immigrants trying to find their way here is significant. Abuse that is repeated from generation to generation, I see. And of course, we also know that there's so much trauma in terms of the ways in which people who are gay or transgender have been abused and mistreated. There's a lot of historic and intergenerational trauma that affects us all at some level, but some far more than others. And when we work with these vulnerable populations, we need to know that, yeah, consequences of terrorism aimed at a specific group. That's another one of the many different types. A lot of prejudice, Islamophobia, others. Yeah.
Thanks, Naja. Before adding in the Islamophobia, so sometimes it's not even historical, but it's not just saying it's ongoing, right? So Islamophobia is a good example or of a current context. I know there's lots and lots of other examples where, right, so yes, there's a stereotype, and now the dominant culture or the world has started to typecast and I guess, yeah, pick on folks the way certain groups were throughout our history, right? And as I just said, it's not just in history, but ongoing. But what the point I want to make is that it sometimes, depending on how it's framed or how it's presented, the behavior of governments and countries and certain people in position of power could be that, oh, we're doing this to protect you. We're doing this because it has to happen for the greater good. And it's like, you know, it's one of the same, right? So if you're hurting people in an organized, systematic way or not, it's still traumatic for the receivers of that behavior. Right, yeah, and it's ongoing, right? So systemic issues, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, or ableism, there are so many things that are built into our policies, procedures, practices at an institutional level or even at a government level that, you know, help folks to continue to engage in it, or that force us. Right? So that's the other thing as well, is that force us to perpetuate it. Even though you may be like, this is racist, you might be told, okay, we'll look into it, but remember, it's a policy, you have to do it. Or, okay, I get it. And oh, remember, I still need to do follow up on them. Like, okay. So typically when those things happen, it's because of systemic issues that are built in and well entrenched in our institutions or even society at some point. Windbrush, yeah, example. So from here, so Nadia talked about historical and then current context. So there's, we've talked about some of these. So experience of some targeted groups. So whether it's children, immigrants, women, girls, trans, gay, bi, two-spirit folks. I want to think about any time a group is being targeted and is being, ongoing targeting. So it doesn't have to be genocide, right? But it's the idea is that ongoing feeling of danger or not feeling safe, even though we live in a place like Canada or a first world country is what makes it traumatic. And the picture on the bottom right is there, we talked about medical illnesses and car accidents, is that even when we engage in healthcare settings or mental health services, the process of engaging with the system itself could be traumatizing, right? Where the story or the lived experience of the person could be minimized if the medical professional or the mental health professional feels like, right, so yeah, I get it, you came from another country, I get it, and all I can do is whatever else, right? So we'll also talk about in a little while about, okay, we need to put some boundaries around us, focus on what we can control, what we can't control, because that's how we protect ourselves as care providers. But the way we convey that message could be done in a trauma-informed way, right? The way you deny services or reject an application or what have you could be done in a supportive way, even if it means saying, you didn't meet criteria at this point, and here, but I can help you look for another service or resource or whatever. Right? But it's, I want to say that sometimes we ourselves may be required to cause trauma and know fully well that we are causing trauma. But the reason we may still be doing it is because it's part of our job, and we might be feeling like, okay, I just need to, hang in here for a while until I can find another job or do something else. Yeah, so microaggressions in the workplace, or well, not even workplace, yeah, in medical on all cuts or use medical. Oh, okay, yep. Having people as their, yep. Okay, I didn't know that on, yep. Yeah, and I forget if it was with the college, or in some of my DIR work at the WK, but I actually didn't know about medical racism. And we're not talking about racism in healthcare, or we're talking about what Nadia's talking about, which is targeted experimentation and use of certain groups of people.
Yeah, so, and then Anya talked about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments where African Americans were infected with syphilis and not treated for generations for medical experiments against their will, and Holocaust survivors. So, for example, my grandfather was in the concentration camps, and they did experiments on him. And so as he got older, it was very hard for him to trust any doctor because the Nazi doctors did so many medical experiments as part of the many different crimes they committed during the Holocaust.
Thanks for sharing that, Nadia. It's yeah, it's distressing at times to think about what folks have gone through. Even though we talked about resiliency, and thinking of, right, so folks function, they go through their daily business, their families, they have jobs. And really, it's not until you hear about some of those stories from people or loved ones that yeah, we might start to realize, okay, so it's not just a historic event, it's still happening, right? Or maybe to a different degree. Then right, and then yeah, I was saying those attitudes get passed down. So yeah, so the fear of doctors is what Nadia is talking about, but in terms of the attitudes, you can think of that as a intergenerational or transgenerational pathway for trauma as well, where a child could be given the message, stop, look both ways before you cross the street, Or the message could be, don't trust doctors because doctors cause harm. Or don't trust police officers because police officers cause harm. So when children or people that look up to us or that are depending on us to keep them safe receive those messages, of course, they're going to believe a parenting figure or a safe adult, which again, if you think about it, the person making those statements is saying it for very good reasons. But even if that may not cause fear in the person, because they may actually not know what it means, avoiding services, avoiding so doctors seeking medical care could cause them further physical harm or traumatic harm as well. Oh, I see. No, I'm definitely gonna look that up because I did not know about that piece of information. I should know that. Yeah, fear of authority figures in general. Yeah, so absolutely. So residential school survivors. Yeah, no one in authority. And also, it's not, so we know there's a very clear established history of residential schools and what that means. But it also, sorry, I should say on top of that, also thinking about the experiences of some targeted groups, even if it's from a situation where they can't trust people in power, can't trust authority figures, right? So we're talking about, well, trust is trust, the same as breaking trust with the client or with the child or a vulnerable person where they may have been told certain things are going to happen, will happen, and it never does, right? So the interpretation is, right, you're going to say a lot of things, yeah, nothing's going to happen, I need to look out for myself. Or the other thing is, so for targeted groups and specifically for Indigenous folks, is being given resources without really considering how applicable they are to the individual's needs or not. Right? So I'm talking about examples of where certain groups or communities have been given lots and lots of money so we know money is helpful, but what those folks actually wanted or required was certain types of help or resources and not just a check, right? But as far as society is concerned, the perception could be, what's the problem? Why are folks complaining? The federal government just gave this grant or so on and so forth, right? So even that experience of being judged by a bigger group or a society without, even though, I know, right, they just don't know what they don't know, but feeling that level of judgment and persecution on top of the fact that, I'm experiencing this from my own government or people that are supposed to keep me safe is going to add to that experience of trauma. So yes, thank you everybody for adding to the conversation and participating, and I appreciate and really thank everyone who's shared personal examples and their family and historical examples as well. The next general group, which again, we've talked about these in one form or another, is to also think about the experience of intersectionality or what intersectionality might mean or how that could be a complicating factor. So when you're thinking about this idea of multiple group memberships or belonging to groups that aren't easily identifiable by just looking at me or listening to me, what are some examples that you can think of where individuals who have multiple group memberships, if you will, or identities could experience either chronic toxic stress and or traumatic experiences?
Again, please put your answers in the chat.
And it's okay if we've already talked about the causes. I just want to explore the idea of the complexity of it all. If a person belongs to multiple groups, right, or has multiple group identities.
Can you repeat the question? Is one of the questions.
Oh, thanks, Nadia. So yeah, so so I've had intersectionality. So the idea, or basically what I'm trying to get at is to think about individuals who may experience toxic or chronic stressors or trauma because they are impacted in multiple ways. So not just because I have brown skin, but it could be because I have brown skin and I'm a gay male, or it could be I have brown skin, I'm a gay male, and I'm hard of hearing, or I'm brown skin, gay male, hard of hearing, and I have a white child, so on and so forth. Right? So you think about, I have multiple identities, which could cause me to experience stress, so toxic chronic stress and or trauma. Okay, so bipolar youth who identified as trans, so female, male. So being elderly, an immigrant person who is Black and gay and has a disability. Gay male clients express their discomfort being in an all-male residential treatment facility. Yeah, absolutely. So new to Canada, don't speak the language, and different culture, living in a rural area, right? So that is a multi-layered, but a great example. And so new to Canada, not necessarily traumatic, but if I was delivering a certain version of this, yeah, anyways, I won't get distracted. So yeah, so being in a new country, new environment, don't have an ability to communicate reliably, from a different culture, which means I may not know how to practice meet my cultural needs in this new environment. And Lynn's ended up with living in a rural area, and you don't need to be from another country and not speak English, right? So we know that folks that live in rural areas or outside of urban hubs are disadvantaged and may not be to the point where they're experienced as chronic toxic stress or trauma, but there are absolutely some ongoing stressors or traumatic experience that folks may have because they're not in a dense urban area. Okay, so yeah, perfect. So thanks so much, folks. And then, so the invitation here is to think about this for, well, all of this for our clients and the client's experience, but then also remembering, I know you know this, but remembering that we're also human, which means we could be experiencing all of these for ourselves as a human being first, and in our role as a care provider. Yep, chronic illness, trans person living with multiple disabilities. Yep, absolutely. Okay, so usually you want to see,
you have to wait.
You have to wait. Seek examples, and then kind of start with what we know cause challenges, stressors, or experience of trauma for most people, and then what I'm going to do next is to take it even further, if you will, or broaden it even further, and talk about everyone's human needs, right? So thinking about social determinants of health, which are our basic needs, regardless of whether I'm a newcomer, trans person, foster parent, adoptive child, or whatever the circumstances. Right? So you're thinking about what are those basic needs? And we talked about poverty in general, but that's what typically comes to mind for me when you talk about this is, right, we know poverty is alive and well, just like a lot of the isms. And so thinking about, right, how can we support individuals that we're sort of take that into consideration as we support our clients
You have to wait. Go lie down.
if that's impacting them, and then also thinking about it for ourselves, right? So not to be overly stigmatizing or put additional pressures on ourselves if we ourselves are experiencing some challenges or have some needs based on basic necessities of life. And then when I was looking for a graphic, I came across this, and then interestingly enough, it was actually from the government of Canada. So I knew what social determinants of health were, but I thought, oh, it's interesting that the federal government of Canada describes these 12 items as determinants of health. Now, mind you, there's about a year and a half at this point, so there could be some new items there. But I thought it was encouraging that they are talking about things like education and literacy, childhood experiences. So it's not just about, right, do you have food, shelter, clothing? They are starting to incorporate some of these concepts or factors that we as social workers or care providers in general know cause issues or challenges. Coping skills, health services, biology, gender, culture, race, and racism. So as I said, I'm not sure if these were always there, but I thought it was interesting that this is the list that they had in the federal Department of Health website at that point. So from here, what I want to do is, so now think about, okay, so it could be anything. And as I remember, it doesn't necessarily mean that folks are automatically experiencing as trauma. And if you think about it, there's lots of folks living in poverty that are doing A-okay. They've figured things out. They're managing, getting about their daily lives. The experience may not be pleasant, but if you're thinking about it again from a resiliency lens, those folks are managing, right? And with help of others, if they have the ability to receive help. Now, in terms of the impact of these, so if we think about, or now even in terms of health, is to think of, who are the most vulnerable people, right? So somewhere along the way, I said, it's not just, babies and little kids, it could be any of us. And yet what we know is that the earlier the experience of adversity, chronic or repeated stressor and or trauma, the longer the process is for that individual to develop coping strategies that aren't going to cause them further harm. And it may, so not always, may take a little bit longer for those individuals to even get to a point of being able to function safely in their environment. So the point is, anyone can experience trauma, but the younger the experience of trauma, the longer it might take for that person to engage in pro-social or safe coping strategies. So at this point, I just want to make reference to ACEs, or the adverse childhood experiences. So similar to some core things I've been covering. So the ACEs study is the foundational piece of, I guess, research that most people reference. And so the main thing to keep in mind is that this is a study that has happened initially a few decades at this point. And since then, it's been replicated with limitations and criticism, mainly around the fact that, first of all, it's a very scientific process. And just like with all research, folks may not, the whole population may not agree to participate in research studies. But the main limitation the multiple authors have identified, or folks like us that are in supportive roles have identified, is the lack of cultural or historical factors that aren't included in the tool, right? So we started off with a study, and now there is an actual tool that can be implemented or used with adults, even though what the tool measures is the experience of adversity in childhood. So this is from so again, it's about a year, no, it's less than a year, directly from the CDC, so the US Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente were getting this information from. So here they're saying the adverse childhood experiences or ISIS are potentially, so that's because, remember, not everyone gets impacted the same way. It could be caused by experiencing violence, abuse, and neglect, which, yep, so we know that. And then we also talked about the vicarious aspect of it, right? So witnessing violence in the home or in the community. And then we also talked about this, or living with a family member or any care provider who may have attempted suicide or has died from suicide. So what they're trying to get at here, specifically by targeting or using the word suicide, is to draw attention to the level of functioning of that primary caregiver prior to their death, versus the actual behavior of attempting to end their life or dying from suicide. So I just want to make sure you folks know that it's not the end result or the attempt, it's about the experience of a person. Remember, we're talking 0 to 17, as they may have been trying to manage whatever the circumstances that led them to make that decision. And then they go on to say, also included are aspects of a child's environment that can undermine their sense of safety, ability, and bonding. The key words is environment and a sense of safety, right? So it's not even actual safety, but so at this point it's the same as what we talked about earlier about psychological safety. It's about their feeling of safety in their living environment, as well as their ability to have safe, attached relationships. So here again is just broad-based generic information. So growing up in a household with people who use substances, who are dependent on substances or require mental health support, or instability in a home or home setting due to parental separation, or household members being in jail or prison. So you see the last category, so parental separation or incarceration, it doesn't have to be just that. Those two examples, but I want you to focus on the word stability. Right? So here you can think of children or youth needing to come into care for multiple reasons, who could have the same experience, even if it is not caused by separation, divorce, or a parent not being able to, or a parenting figure not being able to live in the home due to incarceration. And then what the initial study and some other studies have come up with as well is that if children, so especially under, so younger children, experience these events, that in adulthood they could, or they're linked, there's a correlation to these folks experiencing or developing chronic medical health issues or illnesses, mental illnesses or mental health needs, substance dependency. And so if you think about it, so if that's the outcome, then it can negatively impact our functioning, right? So ability to go to school, which somebody talked about. So being able to look for a job, being able to get through an interview, and then if we get that far, being able to keep a job, right? Because of the way I might be functioning or coping. Right? And remember, the way I'm coping is still resilient, and yet it may be inappropriate in a professional setting. Right? It may be unsafe or illegal in terms of how society or the legal system describes it. and also earning potential. So earning potential in itself isn't that negative, but what they're trying to get at here is impacting earning potential to the point where you may not be able to provide for yourself. So we know there is, support services in place, but the idea is, again, if you're thinking about the determinants of health, is that the person may not have as much agency or ability, or lack agency or ability or skills to take care of their own needs. So this is the the generic information, if you will. And as I said, the original study was done a few decades ago. And specifically in Canada, so the ACE study has been completed here as well, and more recently. So in Lunenburg, there was a study done where the results were very similar. And so when you see the 76, 56, 69%, 73%, we're talking about the links, right, in adulthood. For folks to develop physical, mental health needs and substance dependency issues as well. And so it's right. So it's from the CDC Canada, but then again through the CASW. I know some Nova Scotians, yay, did a presentation about this. I was going to say last year, but I guess, yeah, we're still in 2021. So Elizabeth Perry, Kevin Dugas, and Nancy Ross did the session. So if you haven't had the opportunity, I'll encourage you to do that as well. And I thought I'd share this because of the Nova Scotia context. But if you're not familiar with ACEs, yeah. Well, Nadia, so if you want professional resources, start with Nadia, or you can...
I will look for this and try to put it up on our professional development activities page.
Perfect. Thanks, Nadia. Good. So the reason that most folks that deliver this type of training or education still reference ACEs is because it has had quite a bit of impact on government agencies, on governments, funding sources, because it's a scientific way of proving that past experiences can predict future outcomes. So for folks like us, it's like, thanks for the scientific evidence, but we know this is common sense, if you will. But for decision makers and governments, this has been quite a helpful study because it helps them with decision making around funding, funding streams, resource allocations, so on and so forth. So it's not at all to the point where it needs to be, but also want to say that that has been a positive outcome of the study, is to help governments and bigger institutions to make some decisions around funding and resource allocation. So then thinking about, I guess, the theory part itself, so we know, we just talked about resiliency, but from the ACEs folks as well, so it can be prevented. Of course, it can be prevented, just like poverty can be prevented, homelessness can be prevented, but it takes a group effort, it takes a focused effort and persevering, right? So that's the key here. I mean, think about, how can we prevent ACEs or childhood experiences? Well, I'm sure we can come up with the list, right? We don't need a recommendation. But as a theoretical framework, so trauma-informed practice is one of the many, many ways we can prevent adverse childhood experiences or minimize the ongoing experience of trauma for children. So I'm going to pull things back again to say, so ACEs specifically looks like children, but when you're talking about trauma-informed practice, doesn't have to be just for children, right? It's for all people who are vulnerable and who are experiencing stress, chronic stress, and or traumatic events. And then, so what I'd like to move into next is thinking about some strategies for consideration. So again, from a theoretical lens first, and then what I want to do is to give you folks an opportunity to apply your existing skill set and also to share strategies and resources you might easily have as well that could help the whole group, including myself. So to structure the strategies conversation, I've broken it down into 4 categories. So take a systemic approach, consider the needs of caregivers. So that would be, so in this context where I'm talking about us or professional caregivers, as well as supporting adults who take care of children or other vulnerable people. Thinking about resiliency as adaptive versus needing it to be always positive. So we talked about that, and then taking a generalist or principle-based approach, because when you're talking about trauma-informed practice, it's nearly impossible to come up with the perfect solution because of the complexity of it all, and also because of the fact that the folks that are offering trauma-informed practice are human beings, right? So if we were robots, maybe it's possible, but because we also have our own experiences of stress and trauma, it is challenging for even small organizations who are highly committed to be completely trauma-informed. So I'll go through each section and offer a bit more information. So for a systemic approach from literature and your own experience may lead you to know that it's not just about our personal level of competency and education, and outside of the professional setting, it's also not about just working with the individual that's in our care. It's about working with their family system, right? And for us, it's about working with our teams, making sure our teams are trauma-informed, and that our organizations support us as well. And then even though you may be trauma-informed or your organization may be trauma-informed, is to think about the environment in which we live, right? The environment in which the client lives outside of our professional relationship. And then also thinking about the historical context that we talked about as well. Right? So a systemic approach, involves all the various levels of intervention other than your individual or professional skill set. And then from ACEs themselves, so as so they have a model, they have a template, if you will, for preventing ACEs. So remember, for ACEs, it's specifically for children. So the 6 things that they recommend is, at a systemic level, is to focus on strengthening economic supports to families, promote social norms that protect against violence and adversity. And when they're talking about violence, adversity is not just the experience of violence, but it absolutely involves witnessing violence as well. Ensure a strong start for children. So a strong start, they're talking about supports, it could be economic, but then the idea is to not just support the children, but then support the adults around them so that the adults can actually raise their kids and make sure that they are safe and healthy. Teaching skills, whether it's to the children or teens themselves or caregivers, connecting clients with caring adults or activities other than yourselves, I just say that, and intervene to lessen immediate and long-term harm, right? Which is not just ACEs, that's the ultimate goal, even in social work as a profession. So what I'd like to invite you folks to do, sort of keeping in mind that this is just looking at younger clients. Well, I guess not, I shouldn't say that. You could be working with adults who have young children as well, is to share areas of overlap or work tasks that you have within your role or as a social worker, which meets the 6 recommendations. not sure if the question is clear and saying, what are you doing already as part of your role or as a social worker that allows you to or helps you to strengthen economic support, promote social norms, ensure a strong start for children, teaching skills, so on and so forth. Okay, to connect to community resources and services. Thanks, Nadia. Yeah. A little clarity there.
So yes, applying for funding for families, advocating to connect youth families with community supports for services. Anyone else have any? Coordination of care with parenting classes for the adults. Teaching stress and coping skills, anxiety, also managing depression and running groups. Intervening when risk is high in child welfare to ensure their needs are being met. Education on addictions, better medical navigation for transient folks. There are some cities in the US that have received funding to try to prevent ACEs by integrating into classrooms, meditation, mindfulness skills, as well as providing training to staff to learn about trauma-informed care as part of the educational system. And they have seen their statistics radically different than traditional, so-called traditional education. Wow. Other components, providing therapy to parents to increase their coping skills. That's another great component. I will put in the chat some information about that ACEs prevention model. Here we have work with child protection with our high-risk kiddos and collaborate to have children in the home with caring adults who can provide care short or long term. So it's great to think about already, even if there isn't some fabulous grant that can get happening, the things that we're doing are in theory, right, working to address or promote these recommendations. Our advocacy to strengthen economic supports to families to fight against poverty. These are just a few examples of what we do.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, folks. Advocate at a policy level. Yeah. Yeah, equine therapy. Research opportunities, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, perfect. So the reason I wanted to kind of pose the question is to get you thinking about, right, what are the gaps? What are you already doing so that you can decide, right, I want to do more of it? Or if you have the ability or the energy, to think about, right, are there areas in my own practice that I want to focus on to make the experiences better or safer for individuals, whether that means, so change the way you practice, which is in your control, or it could be seeking additional education or so on and so forth. And that's because within the professional social work, we're inherently trauma-informed, right? So similar to all helping professions, regardless of whether you're a social worker or not, have a lot and lots of overlap with trauma-informed practice. But in particular, social work there's lots and lots of overlap already. And then thought I'd just share this. Now this is specifically looking at supporting refugee and immigrant youth. But if you're thinking about it as a framework or generalist approach, it doesn't have to be just for refugees and immigrant youth. But just want to share the resource if you are working with newcomers as a demographic, or if you have newcomers and refugees in your caseload. And then the next thing, so this is again coming from the practice guide from BC Health, which is, you know, it's up there. It's getting a little dated, but it was another foundational piece of work, is to break things down for resources and services and supports at an organizational level, professional level, and personal level. So the way I want you to think about this is, so we'll start with personal, right? So personal is just that's you. So as a human being first, you know, what are your needs? Are your needs being met so that you can be a professional? Right? So when you look at that middle tier of a professional, you can think of yourself as now not a human being, but a human being who is a social worker. Another way to think about this is you're a human being who's a social worker who is on a team, right? So you could be, you know, somebody said they were with Schools Plus. You can think of for the middle tier within the Schools Plus team, what's available already, or what could you access if you need support as you're doing your job. And at an organizational level, so here you can think of the organization, the institution, or the system in general to look at, right, what are policies, practices, procedures already in place, or the government level, systemic level is even thinking about legislative requirements or guidelines that could be supportive or limiting. Right? So similar to systemic racism and sexism that we talked about earlier, is to think of, okay, what's already there, and is it enough, or is it something there that's actually not helpful at all? Controlling for means, shifting from person center rather than policy mechanism behaviors. Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nadia. And then from here, I want to make a quick connection. So I know you probably know this or you know this concept, but also thinking about it from a micro, mezzo, macro level, which may be more familiar to you folks as social workers or professionals. So again, thinking about it, you know, right, so what can you do individually? How can you support an individual person versus, you know, within your organization, within the family system for the client, or at a system level that we talked about. And then the other thing that stood out to me with trauma-informed care and practices is something, again, that's been around for a while, which is thinking about this concept of person in the environment, right? So it's not just about the individual need or the treatment goal or the specific issue for us as care providers, or the specific issue for the system. It's about what else is going on for the person that needs to be addressed, so that they are able to function at their best the way they want to and be an independent person. So for the next category, it's always considering caregiver needs when you're thinking about supporting your clients. So you folks know, right? So if you're working with a child, or the client is a child or a teen, that we absolutely need to support the family system. So to think about, right, how do we support the adults in this relationship for the family? And then for us, thinking about it in the same way, right? So I'm a caregiver to my personal family members, but I'm a professional caregiver in my role, right? So if you're thinking about the term caregiver, the function is still the same, even though I get paid for one, I don't get paid for another. So the house on the far right is a clinical framework that the IWK uses. So some of you may be familiar with it, because we're are talking about not we, I should say, at an intersectorial level, Department of Community Services and Department of Education are considering it. So it's not active yet. The reason I wanted to put the graphic here is that even in a clinical framework, so it's called ARC, which stands for Attachment, Regulation, and Competency. You'll see that one of the building blocks, if you will, of the house is caregiver affect management, right? So and so there is, again, to say that even in a clinical framework, they're saying, okay, we should intentionally or purposefully think about supporting not just the caregivers of the client, but then our own functioning as well. And then from there, I want to go through a few slides looking at our own functioning and helping ourselves if we have the ability, right? If your workplace allows you to do it, and if not, thinking about how you could take control of what's happening to you if possible, and improving your circumstances. So from Green Cross ethical guidelines for standards of health for self-care. So it's a lovely program, and I like it. But the main resource I want to draw attention to is the 10 Academy. So they're a Canadian company based out of oh my goodness, not Hamilton, can't believe it. Kingston. My daughter lived there for 5 years, Kingston, Ontario. So they're a local Canadian company, if you will. It's not that they're the only individuals, but I have my training from those folks around strategies for developing resiliency for ourselves, and also to teach information about how to develop staff wellness and improve staff resiliency. And it's not just ends, as mentioned, there's lots and lots of other strategies as well, or concepts that have been around for a while. And what I'd like to remind folks or introduce is this idea of, so here, they're talking about circles of control, or even thinking about the idea of focusing on what's in your control versus what's not in your control. And depending on which model you're looking at, you may also have that middle tier, which is looking at what's so may not be in your control, or not in your control, but could be within your realm of influence, right? So for me, that's where all care providers, but specifically social workers, may have a lot of agency, is to know that, right, there are a lot of things that we can absolutely control. But there are a lot of things we can control that, by nature of the way we operate and the way our values and principles are structured, is to advocate. So if you're thinking about the middle tier of circle of influence, I want you to think advocacy for your clients, but then in this context specifically, thinking about our own ability to advocate for our needs and increase our sense of physical safety and psychological safety. And then you're thinking about this idea of what's in your control, what's not in your control, is at some point is to accept your current circumstances for what they are. So if you remember that picture we looked at during the conversation on resiliency, you had a tree that was bent due to wind and storms and what have you. So this is what I want you to think about is, it doesn't mean that you're giving up when you accept your circumstances, but even neurologically, what we know is that if you accept your circumstance and situation, the ability for us to then move on or seek help or accept help is much easier than if we keep resisting our experience in the moment, right? And so I'm not saying you need to like it, but it's very different when we're talking about acceptance. From here, the other thing I want you to think about, because of what we do, so especially as social workers, but as care providers in general, are the various different types of relationships that you may have, right? So I want you to think about in your personal life as well as in your professional life. So whether you have your own children or not, some of you may be supporting children professionally. And then there could be situations where we're not just supporting kids, but also supporting parents and grandparents, whether as clients or our own family members. And then so again, looking at now expanding it from our own personal relationships to could also be friends, right? Or extended family that we're caring for. And then from here, I want you to think about the fact that we're compassionate human beings to begin with, which means that we're not gonna just ignore people if they're not, part of our caseload, or if they're not in our family. Right? So thinking about, we might be caring for a lot more people than we realize. And then thinking specifically about our professional capacity is to think of, okay, what are all the different types of professional relationships we have, whether it's with our clients or even within your organization. And then from there, so we talked about, roles already, and someone talked about peer group for directors or people in leadership. And the reason I want you to think about that is that you may not think of yourself as a caregiver for people who report to you, because we're all bright, competent people. But the reason I'm saying that some roles may have a caregiving function is because the folks that report to you aren't dependent on you, but they are relying on you to keep them safe or to guide them. And then the last category I hear is supporting each other. Right? So your coworker, as we talked about that when we had the conversation around flocking and supportive groups. So it could be in a formal way, as in peer support or clinical supervision, or it could just be because you're friends, right? And somebody talked about having friends who are also social workers, and so on and so forth. So when you're looking at this, hopefully it makes sense. And the main takeaway message is that you may be in multiple caregiving roles, even though they're not your personal family members or professional clients. So before I move on, just want to know if there are any questions about anything I've talked about so far. Put it in the chat.
I'm not seeing any.
So what I'm going to do, folks, is to take less than a minute, hopefully, to go and refill my cup because my throat's getting dry. I don't want to cough at you folks for the remainder of this. I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. Right back.
No worries, but meanwhile, I do want to call everyone's attention to some of the comments in the chat, as well as I did post the CASW video, which featured our own Nancy Ross. And if you're not familiar with CASW, there's a lot of wonderful trainings, including more on trauma-informed care that you can access there. Prasanna appears to be back, so I will let him continue.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. All right, so I'm looking at the time, and what I'm going to do is to skip through a few slides, not because they're not important, but because I want to get to some core content. So as an FYI, so I'll still include these slides when I share them with Nadia, so you get to see them. And the slides that I'm skipping through talk about potential outcomes of caring work on care providers, like compassion fatigue, empathic strain, burnout, moral distress, so on and so forth. So the reason I decided to skip through those slides because there are other sessions that talk specifically about those items. But then for the remainder of the time, I will pick up here, which is looking at acknowledging the reality and cumulative effects of the type of work that we're doing. So in this graphic, I don't have it set up to do this, but it starts at the very top where it says personal vulnerabilities. So here, the invitation from the authors of this material is to get us to think about our own lived experiences, our own current living experiences or circumstances before we think about our professional work. And then if we go to the right, the next item talks about work-related traumatic grief or loss. So here I want you to think about examples that some of you shared around clients losing loved ones, right? But here it could also be situations where you yourself are losing a loved one in your personal life, or you could be losing a client because they've passed away. Right? So, and for that, to that point, I also want you to think about it may not be while the client is still in your care, but it could also be a situation where you hear about a client that you supported in the past that may have passed away. The other way these folks talk about work-related grief and loss is also in the context of losing professional relationships. So it could be a situation where you had a lovely relationship, whether it was as a friend or a mentor or a support person in a professional setting, and they may have retired, right? Or they may have gone to another job. So even though we're like, okay, you know, we know what to do, we know our job, the idea here is that depending on how much of a relationship you had with them, that some of us may be impacted by their departure. For direct exposure, they're talking about those experiences that are highly stressful and or traumatic, right? Where we're actually getting physically hurt or psychologically impacted because of the work that we're doing. So it could be, so getting physically hurt. We talked about clients yelling, screaming, threatening, those types of things, versus what they're calling indirect exposure, which is looking at the concept of secondary or vicarious trauma. Right? So here we're talking about same experience or function that we talked about with our clients, which is that, you know, just by virtue of the fact that you're in certain environments, by virtue of the fact that you're receiving reports, shift change, staff meetings, trainings like this, it could be a situation where your brain is now going into protective mode because it's overly exposed to traumatic or challenging information. Right? So that's the difference between direct exposure and vicarious trauma, indirect exposure, or secondary trauma. For empathic strain and compassion fatigue, so the first thing, if you're not familiar with that terminology, is that we're never ever going to run out of empathy or compassion because we're human beings. But you may experience this because your job requires you to be empathic and compassionate without having the ability to take a break or walk away. Right? So it's not that you're going to run out of it, but our brains could get fatigued. So that's where the fatigue and the strain part comes in, because we don't have a choice because it's part of our job. For moral distress, so I'm glad they've added in the term systems failure, because it's typically systems failures or systemic issues that cause this. So for moral distress, they're talking about experiences for us where you're required to do certain things, or you're being told explicitly you cannot do something because of your role or your job description, even though as a human being, you know, this person just needs whatever it is, right? Or this person does not need one more visit or meeting or assessment or what have you. So here I want you to think about the conflict between what you're asked to do versus what your personal values are or even professional values are. For burnout, nowadays, rather than just call it burnout, they're saying think of your working conditions, right? So here it is about the pace of the work, the amount of the work, versus the emotional or the empathic strain or the compassion fatigue. So here it could be the emotional impact of doing so much work or working under staff or working under resource, but it typically has to do with the work itself that may or may not involve other human beings, right? So caseload management, documentation, learning new procedures, doing certain things that don't involve clients, so on and so forth. And then a few years ago, they added in the last bubble here, so socio-cultural context, to get us to think about again, so not our past experiences, which is personal vulnerabilities, but our current circumstances, even if it's not adverse or traumatic, right? So here I want to think of those conversations or examples we talked about on this slide with that had intersectionality, right? So you could be one of those folks that have multiple identities that are also experiencing oppression and systemic isms, and then and you're working in a system, right? And you're providing care to vulnerable people or people who need support. So the idea here is to know what the specific terms are. And apologize that I didn't go into it with a lot of detail because I wanted to cover some core items. But the main takeaway message here is that it doesn't have to be one or the other. And it definitely also doesn't have to be all of these. But to be aware that in the types of environments we work in and with the type of work we do, that there could be this stacking effect or the cumulative effect. And so in terms of what to do about it, so there are absolutely some sessions as well. And if not, I know Nadia is working on specifically addressing vicarious trauma, and I know Nadia already talked about a strategy that's already in the works starting in 2022 to help us with that. But just as part of this conversation, I want to invite you to think about, regardless of what your experience is, whether it's general day-to-day stress, whether it's positive or tolerable, whether it's toxic or more serious than that, including traumatic, is to think about your resiliency factors, right? So, and that's because those are things that your brain's already comfortable with. And then if you're thinking, oh my gosh, I can't even think about that, is to start with, why did you get into this type of work? Why did you pick social work versus another profession? And then from there, think about, okay, so things are really rough. So accept that, acknowledge it, and then think about when things aren't rough or stressful or hectic, what do you enjoy about your job? And then, it doesn't mean the stress is going to go away, but the idea here is to remind yourself about why the heck it is that we do what we do, right? Because it's really, really rewarding, and it can also be stressful and challenging at times. So start with that reflective activity, and then think about gratitude. So grateful for in your personal life and your work life. And that's again to slow you down a little bit, hopefully distract you in the moment, or once you've done this activity, is to remind yourself, right, it's a rough day, it's a rough week, it's a rough month, and then reflect on, oh, what did I put down as things that I enjoy about my job? What did I put down as things that I'm grateful for, even though this is a challenging job at times? And then as you're thinking about that, we started with this, is to reflect on your support network and your relationships in your personal life, but then also in your work life or professional life as well. And that's because the basic survival need that we all have, even though we're adults, is a need to belong, right? And be accepted and be loved. So you think about, right, so don't, just think about love and acceptance and belonging as a child issue or something we reserve for vulnerable people, but then even as functional, competent adults, we also need that love and acceptance, right? And so think about, who are the people in your lives that you can reach out to and seek support from. And then from there, thinking about, okay, so that's great. Now, what are some actual practical strategies that can help you manage your stress or add to your list of coping strategies? So I'm just going to offer a piece of information you may already know about this or not, is to differentiate between self-care and self-soothing. So the difference is that self-care would be activities that you're doing on an ongoing basis, or you're doing it because someone told you you should, right? Like a friend, like a parent, like a doctor, or you read a book that said you should walk, you should do yoga. So these are things that we know have a very, very practical and important function for keeping us physically and mentally well. But I also want you to reflect on what are your self-soothing activities or strategies. And that's because regardless of how much of or a well-established self-care routine you have, all of us have certain things that we do in the moment that makes us feel really, really relieved or emotionally or physically soothed or really, soothed, depending on what's going on. Right? So sometimes those could be healthy things. Sometimes they may not be. Right? So for me, remember I said I like wilderness camping. So I can't always go wilderness camping. So that's a self-care thing that I do. But what I do now for self-soothing is to have some pictures that I've taken while I've been out and about in the woods or with my dogs or even engaged in certain activities that I can look at. Sometimes something I do, which I know is not unique to me, is in for the self-soothing list, is to also think about food that I enjoy that I know is not the healthiest for me, but I know, okay, I enjoy it enough that if I eat it or drink it, I'm gonna get that immediate sense of relief. So that's the difference, if you will, for self-care versus self-soothing. And then what I'm going to invite you folks to do is to think about what you have or what you're engaging in right now as a competent adult to manage your stressors. So you can think of it as, what are you doing now that would fall under the category of self-care? And if you have some self-soothing strategies, that's great, but if not, that's okay as well. So, don't have to put it in the chat, but what's important is that you have at least a moment to think about what's in place. And so at the start of the day, remember we talked about hobbies, talents. So I want you to think, even if you don't have any specific self-care or self-soothing strategies, is to think of your hobbies at least, right? Or things you enjoy. Okay, yeah. So regular massage appointments, theater, monthly meetup with groups, yeah, perfect. Walks, early morning gym. Okay, yeah, take time to yourself at least once a day. That's really, really important. Family, pets are great. They don't let you, do work or stay on task. They demand attention. Haircuts, perfect, yeah. Stretching, sleeping in, yeah. Oh, you're saying you're retired, but if you can, sleep in anyways, once in a while. Perfect. Thanks, folks. And yeah, so I took the picture down, like I say, self-care toolkit. So you don't have to have a boss, but the idea is to have a list that if you need, a self-soothing activity, so in the moment relief, is to have certain things that you already enjoy or you have ready access to. And so the example I have here is to think about activities that will engage your five senses, because that is a direct connection to our brain, right? So if you think about where we started, which was the neurobiology, when we're thinking about soothing ourselves, calming ourselves, regulating ourselves, we want to be thinking about, right, how do we engage the brain so that we can feel calm or at least start to settle and calm. Breathing, relaxing, protected in our schedule. Yeah, that's important. And you might decide, right, I have a half an hour schedule. I'm not going to do it. But what's important is that you have it in there so that you can make a choice about giving up that protected time. Right? But if you don't even have that in, then yeah, it could be really, really challenging to create time for yourself. Self-talk to stop. Oh, it's putting music on. Every day when Melring. Okay, yeah. All right, folks. So thanks so much for sharing some of those strategies. And then the next is keeping an eye on the time as well, as we already talked about, right? So I'm just going to mention, as part of the 4-part strategy, if you will, is to recognize resilience in our not just in our clients but in ourselves as well. As we talked about that. Right. So in this slide, the main message I want to convey is to reflect on your own survival and adaptive skills. Right? So you don't have to share these because we're getting close to the end of our time together. But when you do have some time, I want you to think about, right, so there could be lots and lots of things that you're doing that are healthy, that are productive, that are pro-social. And there could be some things that you're engaged in because it brings you immediate relief, even though it may not be healthy or appropriate, right? So there's no judgment from anyone. And as you're doing this, please, fight the urge to be self-judgmental as well for your own self. But the invitation here is to do an exploration. And then if you're ready, and when you're ready, is to look for some strategies that could be a bit healthier or safer even for yourself. And then so I also have the graphic circles of control, mainly to get you thinking about, once you've decided, right, so this coping strategy works just fine. And I know when I'm in a calm state, I know it's not the healthiest. When I'm in a calm state, I know it's not the safest. And if you decide to change a strategy, is to think about what we talked about this morning, which is it's going to take time and it's going to take repetition, which means I want you to think of, is it even possible, right? So that's where this graphic comes in, is it in my control to change it? Or is this not a good time to change it, right? So you may be really motivated to change it, and the decision could be, now's not the time, right? Because I'm in school, maybe I have a new infant, or whatever your life circumstances are. It's not that you shouldn't, that you might decide, you know what, by trying to do this, it might actually cause me more stress. But that doesn't mean that you can't change certain things or certain aspects, right? So if you think about the application circle of influence, is to think, okay, I can't completely stop this or change it, but are there other aspects of my life or my life circumstances that I could even adjust that might make the overall outcome a little bit healthier or better for me? So that's an activity that I'll get you to think about. I know I'm kind of rushing to the end line here. And then the final piece here that I'll leave you folks with is to take a principle-based approach. Right? So there are many, many different principles you'll find in the literature. So at IWK Health, we use these 5 principles, which is built by Hallett and Harris. And so you're talking about safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, empowerment. And so the words themselves are pretty straightforward until you apply them in the context of trauma for the client as well as for us. And then also like this, from the American Journal of Public Health, which talks about, adds in transparency, which adds in intersectionality. But the reason I want to share a few of these is to also make the point that there are some common themes here, which is safety, trust, collaboration, empowerment, choice. And then from New South Wales government, so there's again, so safety, trustworthiness, transparency. These folks have added in peer support as a principle. They've added in mutuality and added in cultural, historical, and gender issues to the basic principles. And so what I've done for your benefit, if you will, is to compile some of those common themes. And so I've come up with these as the 6 principles for you to consider for your clients as well as for yourself. So thinking about starting with trauma awareness, right? So I would say this session, if it's the first time you've received information about trauma-informed practice, would fit this principle of trauma awareness. If you've had other trainings, whether it's academically, webinars, hopefully there was some additional information that you picked up along the way today that meets this principle of trauma awareness. And then thinking about safety is to think about, it's not just physical safety, but emotional, psychological, cultural, and intersectional. And remember, it's all of this is for clients and us. Choice, trustworthiness, empowerment, collaboration. So the reason why I sped up the last couple of principles is not because they're not important, but it's because when you're interacting with people or even for yourself, being able to trust someone, being able to learn things or build on our existing skills, or being able to collaborate will come naturally if the person is supporting me or taking my own experiences into account, or if the person is ensuring that I feel safe or that I am safe, or if the person is giving me some choice, even if it's in a restrictive environment like a treatment center, inpatient setting, correctional service, justice setting, so on and so forth. So this is in terms of our own experience, but then if you're the person providing care, is to think of, okay, so you know your jobs. So if you think of collaboration, empowerment, trustworthiness, these are core skills for folks like us in social work. But the invitation here is, as you're working with folks and things aren't going the way you anticipated, is to pause, back things up for yourself to see, oh, did I miss something about their past experiences that I didn't know? Did I miss something where they don't feel safe in my company or in my setting? Or, did I miss something where because of my job or my role, I didn't offer as much choice, or I'm not offering choice because it's my job, right? And that could be, not completely, but could be why the person is reacting the way they are as you're trying to support them. And then as a final note, I guess, I wanted to kind of connect things back to our profession. And then, so I have a little iceberg analogy here, that, the bulk of whatever we do or whatever we observe is under the water, if you will. So for whether it's for social work or any other principle-based approach, is to think of, right, why are we doing what we're doing, right? So for trauma-informed practice, if it was just about trauma-informed practice, I would put that under the surface, if you will. But as a tool, as a new tool for folks, or as an additional tool of pieces of information for folks today, what I'm going to encourage you to do is think of, right, what do you already know? What drives you already, fuels you already, and guides your practice, which are the 6 values and principles. And then think about putting trauma-informed practice as the thing on top of the surface, right? So all that to say, you know what to do, you're confident at it, and this is something you can add to a repertoire or practice to make your clients' experiences better and to make your own experiences safer and better as well. So my apologies, folks. I'm going to stop sharing my slides here. I know we're at time. And the only other activity I had planned for you folks was to get you to actually apply the principles of trauma-informed care practice as a group. However, earlier on, remember Nadia said that I will share a handout as well when I share the slides. So what I invite you to do is to think of what you are doing already as a professional and in your organization for each of those principles, and then also think about things you may want to change or do differently now that you hopefully have some additional information about trauma and trauma-informed practice.
Thank you so
So
much.
I'll pause there and I'll hand things back to Nadia.
Thank you so much, Prasanna, for sharing this and for not only reinforcing, this is already trauma-informed, reinforcing that what we're already doing is already good enough and that we just need to do a little bit more of what we're already doing. And the fact that this is evidence-based means that for many of our colleagues who appreciate evidence-based theory, we can reference evidence-based theories in our advocacy for clients as we help our colleagues reframe what our clients are doing from doing bad things to resilience and working to help shift from resilience to coping strategies that might be more successful. I want to thank all of you for being here. We will be sending you out also some surveys as well as the resources, and we appreciate you all. And Prasanna, again, thank you so much. I hope that everyone makes sure to go out and stretch. I don't know where you are in Nova Scotia, but where I am, the sun just popped out. And if you even just go out there for even 5 minutes to get some sunshine, it's amazing what that can do. You deserve it no less than plants deserve sunshine. So with that, have a wonderful day and thank you all so much.